Hi, welcome everyone. We are so excited to invite you back for another bite-sized conversation. Today we are joined by our very own Linda Diamond, and our topic of discussion today is supporting adolescents with word reading difficulties. I'm Monica Ng. I am the Vice President of Education Programs at Pivot Learning, and I'm joined by Carrie Thomas Beck.
Welcome, everybody.
She's the Director of Literacy at CORE. Today, our conversation is going to be with our own wonderful Linda Diamond. So we are so excited and honored to have Linda here with us today.
Let's begin by taking a look at some data. So Mark Schneider, the director of IES, recently released a statement regarding mathematics and reading performance of students in the US. In his statement, Schneider shares recent NAEP data collected before the impact of the pandemic. The NAEP data shows that average scores in reading have dropped from 2015 to 2019 in grades 4, 8, and 12. With the number of students reading below basic increasing across these grade levels. Currently, 30% of our students are below basic in reading in the upper grades. We also have recent NAEP data showing how these downward trends in reading scores are differentially affecting groups based on race and ethnicity. Linda, from your perspective, how would you explain what is happening in our schools?
Well, you can start by looking at the dates that this downward trend started. And unfortunately, the dates have a direct corollary to the Common Core state standards rollout. The Common Core state standards began in 2009. At that point, curriculum materials had not yet caught up, and most schools did not have high quality instructional materials that were aligned to the standards. So teachers found themselves going to the internet, grabbing materials they could find, writing their own curriculum, which of course meant that inequities were going to expand because what students received was different depending on the classroom teacher. They didn't have a coherent system. In addition, in the initial rollouts of the Common Core, the emphasis was on the 6 shifts. None of those shifts included the reading foundational skills. And as a consequence, what also occurred was at the K-3 level, schools turned away from some of the foundational skills focus that they had been doing during the reading first years and began to focus with variable materials on what were the 6 shifts. And this is not something that teachers can be blamed for. That was the focus. That was how teachers took it. Well, you can directly trace the impact to that and look 5 or 6 years down the road and see what happened at 4th, 8th, and 12th grade as a result of a lack of coherent curriculum and a lack of focus on the core, on the reading foundational skills in the early grades. We already had students in the upper grades who had been struggling, but then you started to have students who were coming less prepared as they hit 4th grade and up. And that's an explanation for why we're seeing this trend. Many of us knew this was going to happen because of the way that the Common Core standards were rolled out, because of the lack of important emphasis on the reading foundational skills. But now we're seeing the data that confirms our worst fears. So that is what we think is happening. Now, in addition, you don't see interventions being implemented well with the upper grades. In particular, because we now are able to have high quality instructional materials, there is a tendency with these older students to just have them in high quality instructional materials, which of course are grade level materials and do not contain the components that some of the most struggling students might need for intervention. So we're asking a lot of a core teacher at high school who has 30 plus students to now also try during that limited core instructional time to put in place intensive interventions for those students who are reading at third grade level or below. And believe me, there are a lot of kids who are. And it's not really feasible for these high school teachers or even a middle school teacher to be able to sufficiently intervene on a daily basis when you also have a whole class. So that compounds the problem that we're seeing with today's data when there isn't sufficient time or sufficient content available or sufficient training for a regular classroom teacher who probably can do some very good scaffolding, but it will not be sufficient. And that's why you're seeing these extremely low performance results at the higher grades.
Thanks, Linda. I appreciate you bringing up the importance of intervention for adolescents. I think in many cases, that's a key missing link to their success.
And it just makes sense, the historical perspective, to understand that this is the consequence of policy changes that happened in 2009, I think is important to remember. So it's not necessarily what teachers are doing today in the classroom that have brought about these kinds of shifts in scores, but that it's a consequence of the many years of making this adjustment from different state standards to Common Core standards. So I really appreciate that perspective as well. So, Linda, you and I have talked about this quite a bit, but if you could design intensive care for adolescents who are performing significantly below grade level, what do you consider to be the key instructional components? And just bringing in this, whether you've seen good models for interventions being implemented at the high school or middle school level, and which programs have really excited you that you've seen recently that have gotten you excited about the possibilities of good interventions for adolescents?
Sure, thank you for that question. Well, we actually implemented a strong intervention model for middle and high school. It was part of a Stupsky Foundation project in Pasadena Unified. And it, in fact, became the model for what was to later be the multi-tiered RTI model in secondary schools. We were asked, as a result of the success of that model, to present it to a national group that was responsible for coming up with a model for secondary intervention in a multi-tiered system. So we know exactly what can be done. The issue is having the will to do it and having the understanding at a leadership level in school districts about the need to do it. So let me tell you what I think the models have to include. First of all, there won't necessarily be one right program, because the first part of the model should be based on assessment and diagnostic data. And that means different students are going to need different things. However, if you understand the profiles of students with different reading difficulties, you have those students who have word reading difficulties, then you have those students who are, and that's about 33% of secondary schools, their difficulties might be more in the reading comprehension issues. And then you have the group of students, which is another 33%, whose difficulties are both word reading and comprehension, the mixed group. So you've got a kind of 33, 33, 33. Think about it that way. So that requires some assessment to identify what the needs are of the students. And then you start matching them to the appropriate interventions. Now, what else is an important component? What we did in Pasadena Unified, as well as in several other districts around the United States, once we saw that this was a model that worked, is we had students in a strong core curriculum, first of all. And then for those students that we would identify as tier 2, and these were students who didn't have necessarily significant word reading difficulties as much as they had fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. They might have some challenges with multisyllabic words. And those students were given another period that was a structured intervention, and that would be called tier 2. Then we had the students who were far below and did have significant word reading difficulties. The first group, tier 2 students, were maybe reading 2 grades below. The next group was 3 or more grades below. Many of those students were high school students reading at 3rd grade level or below. Many of them were middle school students reading at 2nd grade level and below. They were in what was called an intensive intervention replacement core. That's an important distinction. They were no longer in their core curriculum. Instead, they had multiple times that included an intensive intervention curriculum that was selected, as well as a period that included the vocabulary and the comprehension that would be associated with a core. So it wasn't that they weren't getting the robust content, but they were no longer just in that period with an add-on. It was quite intensive. So your elements include diagnostics to figure out who these kids are, a selection of an intervention that could be layered into a good high quality core, and then an intervention that in essence was a replacement because of the amount of time. Time was the most important feature of these interventions. We needed at least 90 minutes to make this really effective, and it had to be daily. And that meant also that those teachers had to be well prepared who were involved in this. There are so many programs that are good interventions that were poorly implemented, most often as a consequence of insufficient time. Read 180 would be an example of that. It actually is a strong intervention, but it was often poorly implemented with insufficient time. And so you might blame the curriculum when the cause was less the curriculum and more the implementation. In addition, Read 180, and I'm going to pick on it as an example because we were very involved in the implementation of Read 180. In fact, in Pasadena, we used language exclamation. It was not language live back in those days. As the tier 2 intervention, it had multiple starting points. And that allowed different students to enter at different starting points. And we used Read 180 with System 44 at the secondary, along with some other components at the high school, rather, as a replacement. But we had to do it fully, the amount of time that was needed in order to get the direct teaching that was also a part of it, and that teachers often neglected. And we wanted to make sure they didn't neglect that. And in addition, we wanted to make sure they had access to strong, rigorous content to build the background knowledge and the vocabulary. So we had to set up a very structured time period. So that's what we saw as often a problem, where it just never was implemented in a way that it should be, with sufficient time and sufficient instruction. Now, I'm not saying that you have to have a replacement core. If you're going to keep students in a high quality curriculum with that standards based, you still have to figure out how to have additional time for those students who are way behind, and make sure that the teachers have the right components, the right curriculum that matches the intervention needs. I can tell you for certain that if the students are way behind, for sure, there are word reading difficulty issues. And that means they need an intervention that's designed for that. And that would require additional time. And that would be on top of their core curriculum. So I would, if you want to name some curriculums, I would say that Language Live, the new one, Language Exclamation Live, is excellent. And because it has different entry points based on the placement data, it works very well. I would say that SIPS Plus, for those students with word reading difficulties, would be a nice, easy to add to a robust, high quality core for those students who need the decoding intervention and fluency, but they will also need extra support with comprehension and vocabulary and high quality text, and I could address that in a moment. I would say that Third Quest, which is a relatively new curriculum, does an excellent job of addressing these components and could nicely be layered in, but again, it needs its own time. Ravo does a really good job of this and could also be added in. Flex Literacy by McGraw-Hill is a very good intensive intervention. It was approved in California, just as Read 180 Universal was, specifically for grades 4 through 8 as an intensive intervention that would have to be implemented in addition to their core curriculum. Gosh, I have some other ones on the list. Rewards would certainly be able to be added if you see on the basis of data that you've got students who are struggling at the multisyllabic word level, not at the basic word level. And there are a number that do a good job of this. Reading Plus is very good for students who are struggling with vocabulary and comprehension, but not for decoding. Now, actually, I would add one more. This will be on the list as well, and that's word intelligence, which happens to be CORE's own curriculum that was developed as a U.S. Department of Ed IES curriculum for students who are able to decode and have relative fluency, but are having difficulty at the vocabulary and comprehension level. And it specifically targeted English learners. And so that's another curriculum that would be, and again, my message is to that, have you seen good models and what programs? They have to be matched to what we learn based on the data and the assessments that tell us what's needed.
Such an important point. I fully agree that one size does not fit all when it comes to intervention programs, particularly for adolescent students. Thank you, Linda.
I agree, and I think that the need for that really carefully implemented assessment and diagnostic data, I wonder sometimes if some of that kind of falls away once you get to middle school and high school, that what we really expect folks to be expert in elementary school, there's fewer people who are going to be able to know and recognize those decoding issues potentially in middle and high schools. And so really making sure that you have folks that can speak directly to those word reading difficulty issues at the secondary levels, I think is really critical. And the point that you make about time is so significant, because I think you wouldn't think of putting someone in intensive care for 15 minutes, right? Intensive care needs time in order to be effective. And so I think that your point is really well taken, and but that folks need to take it seriously, that students who are so many grade levels behind can't just pop into a quick intervention and have all of that gap between their current levels of reading and where they need to be addressed in a really short intervention in the way that we would hope to in earlier grades.
Yeah, absolutely. I would add one other thing, and this has to do with the assessments. The challenge we have at the secondary level is many of the good CBMs don't go beyond 8th grade. So you've got, although that's a good starting point even for high school, because if it's a test that can be administered through 8th grade, that's going to tell us something about high school. But in high school, there would be a significant reluctance to administer one-on-one measures, because if you're a high school teacher, for example, you've got so many sections with so many students. We use often two assessments that ProEd offers. One is a test of silent word reading fluency, which is a group administered measure. And the other is a test of silent contextualized reading, which is another group reading measure. And we pick those because they're groups. The others are, teachers can always start with their state assessment and see who the students are that are behind, but then you need to drop down to one of these others, and ideally finding one that can be a group measure. The Gates McGinnity would be another one. There are other ones, but finding those would be important at the secondary level.
Linda, we so appreciate you sharing your words of wisdom and how we can best support adolescents who struggle with word reading difficulties. Thank you so much for your time.
So our mission at Pivot and Core is to partner with educators to design and implement solutions to their greatest challenges in achieving educational justice. And so, as you can tell from these conversations, we're deeply committed to improving teaching and learning for students. And both of our organizations have 20 years of expertise working with districts and schools to support systems, to support delivering curriculum implementation and services aligned to high quality English language arts and math instructional materials.